This is the final video in a series of 3 videos about salt in relation to ME-CFS and long COVID. Now, in the first video I talked about what you could term the sodium paradox in ME-CFS. The fact that in one part of the body, i.e. the bloodstream, there is a tendency to lose salt and develop low blood volume, while in another, within the muscles, there is a tendency to gain sodium, and that actually causes problems at a cellular level and mitochondrial level in the muscles. In the second video, I asked whether simply having a high salt diet, i.e. adding lots of salt to your food or adding very salty foods, might simultaneously worsen the problems going on in the muscles, while also improving what's happening with the low blood volume. And basically concluded that, in my view at least, and while recognising that this is speculative, it is quite likely that a high salt diet is improving one problem and making the other worse. In today's video, I'm going to share with you how I go about boosting blood volume in an effective way while also minimising the harmful effects of a high salt diet on the muscles. But first, my name is Patrick Usher, and I am author of the book Understanding ME-CFS and Strategies for Healing, in which I break down some of the latest, most exciting research into ME-CFS and long COVID, as well as talking about the various treatment strategies that I have tried in order to improve my own quality of life as an ME-CFS patient. The links for that book are down below. Now, if you haven't watched those earlier 2 videos, I would strongly recommend you to do so. I will link them up above now sequentially. But for those who would prefer a quick recap, within ME-CFS there are 2 problems ongoing in relation to sodium simultaneously. Within the bloodstream, there is a loss of sodium because sodium is filtered out excessively via the kidneys. And this is occurring because of a problem within the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, a hormonal network which is responsible for conserving salt in the body. More specifically, that hormonal network is suppressed. And so the ME-CFS patient develops low blood volume, and because they have this ongoing hormonal suppression, they cannot bring their blood volume back up either. And this, of course, leads to some of the characteristic problems of ME-CFS, the exercise intolerance, because there's not enough blood for the heart and muscles to work with, and so they give up really quickly, as well as contributing to the severity of PEM because the body needs an adequate amount of blood flow in order to recover from exercise. At the same time as there is this sodium loss, however, research has also shown that there is an increase of sodium within the muscle cells. And this is happening because of a range of other dysfunctions in the ME-CFS body. And in this case, when there is an increase of sodium within the muscles, they start to become very weak. They start to lose activation strength, force and endurance, basically become dysfunctional. And in fact, there's a whole range of further problems that can then come about from the basis of the higher muscular sodium concentrations, in particular the risk of higher calcium muscle concentrations, which is in fact what post-exertional malaise likely is. So, to kind of put it very simply, the sodium loss is occurring extracellularly in the bloodstream, while the sodium increase is occurring intracellularly in the muscles. Now, this raises some very interesting questions that are not often talked about, because in ME-CFS we're usually just advised to eat as much salt as we like to really boost the blood volume. And given that we don't have enough blood, that makes sense, and of course that is a problem that we actually need to address. On the flip side, we are left with the question, if we do have a high salt diet, like 8, 10, 12 grams a day, which some people do when they have these kinds of illnesses, might we help the low blood volume, but actually somehow increase the muscle sodium content and therefore worsen the problems there with the dysfunctional weak muscles? Now, typically, if you talk to researchers about this, they will say that there probably isn't a risk of doing that. That if you have a high salt diet, it will just stay extracellular and the kidneys will excrete the excessive salt. However, I'm not sure that this is correct, because there's actually a range of more recent scientific papers which are giving us a new science of salt and showing us that the effects of a high salt diet on the muscles and on the cells can actually be quite negative. Now, I went into all of these in the second video, but for example, we know that if you have a high salt diet, you're going to stress out the cells through dehydrating them. You are going to decrease the amount of ATP, which is the central molecule for energy in the body. You are going to damage mitochondria. At amounts of 12 grams a day, you can actually have a breakdown of muscle fibers. You also will diminish the activity of the sodium-potassium pump, which is very important in ME-CFS. And at least in rat studies, we know that a high-salt diet does lead to the accumulation of extra sodium in the muscles and, in fact, all around the body, including in the skin. And this is in contrast to what people used to think. They used to think you have a high-salt diet, the salt just goes into the bloodstream, it increases blood volume, it increases blood pressure, and the kidneys eventually work to excrete it. What's now known is the salt can leave the bloodstream and kind of go all around the body and actually end up getting deposited and causing havoc. So the problem is, what we know from the papers that I reviewed in the second video, is that a high-salt diet can actually cause these kinds of cellular issues, and those cellular issues are important in the context of ME-CFS. Now, in my own case, I know that if I have a very low salt diet, I don't feel good. I have low blood pressure, I get very thirsty, I feel poorly. But I also know that if I have a higher salt diet, I don't feel good either. I get confused, I get disoriented, I start to feel like I actually can crash really easily, that even a few hours after I eat a high salt meal, I basically go into a kind of mini crash. And so something that's I've thought about quite a lot, where can I find the right balance with salt, and is there a way to boost blood volume more safely? Okay, that's been a long preamble summarising the previous two videos. What to do about this? How can we boost the blood volume while avoiding the harms of a normal high salt diet? Well, the basic answer that I have found, and look, this is speculative. I ain't a scientist, I'm not a medical researcher, but I have thought about this a lot. Based on what I have learned and based on my own personal experience, I think that the following things that I'm about to say are, roughly speaking, accurate. So what I do is I boost blood volume by primarily drinking Oral Rehydration Solutions. And these solutions are little packets made up of sodium, potassium, glucose. They're typically drunk when someone has diarrhea or vomiting. They've saved countless lives in the third world. You may have had them yourself when you've had those problems previously. And they're extremely good at replacing lost fluids and electrolytes. But they're also extremely good at boosting blood volume. And this is because the simultaneous presence of the glucose and the salt makes use of something within the stomach called the sodium glucose co-transporter, such that all of that salty solution is pulled effectively into the bloodstream, thereby boosting the blood volume very effectively. Now, this is in contrast to what happens if you just eat a very salty meal, because then you haven't got the kind of glucose and salt in the right proportions, and although some of that salt will get into the bloodstream for sure, it's actually quite hard for the body to process that salt, and so a lot of it ends up going intracellular and starts causing the kinds of havoc and damage that I was referring to earlier. But when you have oral rehydration solution, you bypass this problem, and all of the salty solution that you consume goes into the bloodstream. So what I do nowadays is I typically drink like 1.5 litres, maybe 2 litres, although these days I'm more drinking 1 because I kind of cut it down a bit, but typically speaking 1.5 to 2 litres of oral rehydration solution a day. And that's basically the fluid I drink. I might have a cup of tea, which would be normal fluid, or a cup of decaf coffee, but basically the majority of my fluids come from oral rehydration solution. So that's boosting the blood volume and staying extracellular. At the same time, I don't have no salt at all, but I might have like 3 grams of salt from my foods altogether. So I'm not having a super low salt diet, but I'm having a kind of, it is low by the standards of most people nowadays. I think the average in the UK, for example, is 8 grams of salt a day. But evolutionarily, people were not really having more than 2.5 grams of salt a day if we look at studies of hunter-gatherer tribes. So I'm kind of aiming for around 3 grams. And in practice, that might just mean a few pinches of salt to my food, maybe having one item of food like a bit of cheese or smoked salmon or some cod liver which has salt added, but basically keeping it around there. And I find that this combination allows me to avoid the worst of the effect of salt itself while giving me the salt that my body needs, and at the same time boosting the blood volume with a solution that stays extracellular and thereby avoids the harms of the intracellular salt damage and stress. So that's basically what I do. Now, nowadays when I'm in Romania doing my hyperbaric oxygen treatment, I've kind of relaxed things a little bit because, these treatments take up about 4 hours of my day, and, getting to the clinic, doing the treatment, coming back. And so I've kind of made a pact with myself that I'm eating out for my meals, and the Romanians eat a lot of salty food. So I've had to kind of actually cut down my oral rehydration solution to about 1 litre. And I'm drinking about 1 litre of normal fluid, probably about that. And, having quite salty meals at the moment. And I can tell that salty food is causing this kind of, or contributing to increased muscular weakness and an increased tendency to crash. I also found that when I was having the very high salty meals and drinking 2 litres of ORS, that my blood pressure was going too high. But as I cut it back down to 1 litre, my blood pressure is normal again. So that's something to watch out for, is you really need to get the balance right. You don't want to be having super high salty food and drinking oral rehydration solution in excess, because you could get too high a blood pressure. You want to keep it, 120/80. So at the moment, I'm not kind of following my own advice as much as I would want to. Once I finish these treatments, I want to go back to cooking for myself, because that's what I normally do, and kind of get back, fully in control of what I'm consuming. But for now, it's kind of just a way of having an easier life as I go through these treatments. But that's basically what I would recommend. And, I find that when I have oral rehydration solution, the effect is profound. There has been no supplement that I have used in the 7 years of being ill that has such a profound effect, almost instantly, on how I'm feeling. I mean, I can be in a crash, I can be struggling to move, to kind of lift a hand, to sit up, a drink half a litre or 1 litre of oral rehydration solution over a few hours, and suddenly I can sit up, suddenly I can move around, suddenly it feels like everything has calmed down. I can wake up in the morning feeling pretty rough, like I'm hungover, which is something I often feel with ME-CFS, although I have not had a drop to drink since 2017, I think. I feel that way. I drink 300 or 400 millilitres of oral rehydration solution, and the hangover feeling reduces profoundly, and suddenly I'm much more engaged and able to relate to the world. And my body feels lighter. I can feel the blood volume getting into my legs, into my brain. And I don't feel this way, or only like 20%, if I'm just having a lot of salty food. Like, I find that the ORS is just highly effective. So if you're thinking of something you'd like to try, there are some, the brand that I use is called Normalite, which I'm in Europe. I have to order that from the USA. It's kind of a bore because of the customs costs and the cost of shipping. But it's a very good make, because it's developed specifically for people with ME-CFS and POTS and long COVID, and it doesn't have any strange preservatives or additives in it. So I really like it. I've been using that for 3 years. I do have links, an affiliate link down below in the description box for that, if you want to order using that with no extra cost to yourself. But other options, if you're in the US, include trioral salts, which is the cheapest form of ORS that I have come across. I've seen some people say they've done very well with it. In the UK, in Europe, if you can find Diorolite, like a supplier for that, particularly if you can find the natural version, which doesn't have any added flavourings, that's a very good option for conditions like ME-CFS. Otherwise, just kind of sometimes when you go to the pharmacy for this, any pharmacy will have ORS, it's just that they might have added kind of strange stuff to it, and you might have a sensitive reaction to it. Sometimes people make up their own oral rehydration solution, but you need to be very careful with this. If you don't get it right, you can have serious problems. And If people don't mix the exact correct ingredients with the exact correct amount of water, you can get dangerous alterations in electrolyte levels, and you don't want that. So that's why personally I prefer to buy it already formulated. But whatever form you get, it needs to be made according to the World Health Organization. This is not the same as an electrolyte supplement. It's not the same thing. It's a very specific formulation. And sometimes when I talk about this, people are like, yeah, I already add electrolytes to my water, or I already add salt to my food. It's not the same thing. It needs to be this formulation with the exact correct amount of glucose to salt. And that's what gives it the magic. So if you've already tried electrolytes and you're thinking, I know this already, you might not. Okay, so do actually try or consider trying the Oral Rehydration Solution. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. Again, this is the most helpful thing I've ever used for my own health condition. It may be something, that you'd like to consider yourself. Of course, none of this is medical advice. Everything is offered for educational purposes only. But it is something that's highly effective. And there was one study on this in POTS, which showed it was as effective as a saline IV for increasing blood volume. So it's a very handy tool potentially for the quality of life / healing arsenal of approaches that ME-CFS, POTS and long COVID patients might consider. So there you go. That's how I boost blood volume more safely while also avoiding potential harms of a typical high salt diet. Do let me know your thoughts about this down below. How do you do with a high salt diet if it's normal? Does any of this resonate with you? We will chat there, and I will see you in the next video.